We are talking disinformation with Dr. Sander van der Linden. He is a social psychologist with Cambridge University and director of their social decision making lab. He is going to answer a lot of your questions. Oh, here we go. I'm going to actually invite you in right now so that Edelman's has done an analysis and finds that social media, trust in social media is at an all-time low of 27%. Hi.
Hi, Jessica. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm very good.
Thanks for
Glad to be
joining
on.
us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I just want to give a quick introduction for folks who don't know you. In addition to being director of the Social Decision Making Lab at Cambridge, you are known as the Professor of Defense Against the Dark Arts. You study disinformation and how to combat it, and you've created a video game that tackles this issue by treating it like a virus. A bunch of my friends got addicted to it. I have one friend, Bridget, who keeps sending me her score. We'll get to that.
Okay. Hopefully it's a good addiction, but yeah.
Right? I'm like, you're trading one ill for another. But I wanted to, first off, start by asking you about the larger concept here. You said that you're treating misinformation, disinformation like a virus, and we can inoculate against it. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So I like to think of information as pathogens that can spread from one person to another. Of course, you know, the tricky thing with information versus a real virus is that it can spread without the need for physical contact. So, you know, commentators have said that the most contagious thing about the virus is actually misinformation about it, because it can spread so fast and so wide. And that's really where the metaphor comes in, that if you think of misinformation as a virus, then it makes sense to try to distill an antidote or a vaccine so that we can preemptively inoculate people against it. And the way to do that is actually to inject people with a severely weakened dose of the fake news or the misinformation so that people can build up intellectual antibodies over time.
Okay, so how do you do that?
Yeah, great question. So how do you do that? So in some of our prior experiments, we started out small and we picked a specific topic like climate change, for example, because there's a lot of misinformation out there on the issue of climate change. And we looked at what's the most influential myth that people are being exposed to. It turns out there's a website that claims that, you know, thousands of scientists have signed a petition saying global warming is a hoax, turn out to be influential fake news. So we thought, great, let's use that as the virus and then create a small weakened dose to try to preemptively neutralize that information. So we invited people to participate in our research, and we told them preemptively, we said, look, there's people out there trying to deceive you, and they use specific strategies to try to mislead you. And one strategy is to use fake experts, and they'll show you, you know, petitions and other signatures that looks real, but in fact, it isn't. In fact, often these petitions may contain, you know, signatories that are no longer alive, such as Charles Darwin or the Spice Girls. You know, in this case, this was actually true. And so, yeah, and so, you know, we didn't name the actual petition, so it has to be a weakened dose of it, right? So you're not exposing people to the virus. This is the really important part. You create a kind of weakened dose that preemptively sort of exposes people to the underlying tactic that's being used against them. And so now later on in the experiment, we then exposed people to the full dose, the real website, and we found that people were relatively more immune. They could recognize it, they could recognize the tactics that were being used, and they were less likely to be duped by it. And that, you know, that was specific for a specific issue, and it kind of makes sense for people that, oh, there's a myth, you can create a weakened dose out of that myth, inject people with it, so that over time they become familiar with the kind of misinformation attack or the components of it, and so they become more immune. But, you know, journalists got in touch with us, and they said, you know, the media kind of ran with it and said, oh, fake news vaccine. And so we're like, oh, we better do some more research on this. And so they had great questions. They said, look, you can't sort of preemptively vaccinate people against every single issue. That's very difficult. So how can we scale this in the media landscape? And that was a great question. And the research we did after, including the game, is really built on the larger idea that if you extend the viral analogy, if you look at the RNA or the DNA of the misinformation virus, if it turns out we spend a year looking at, you know, all of the sorts of misinformation that's out there, and we asked, what do all of these stories have in common? What are the structural building blocks of any type of misinformation? Turns out there's some common themes or techniques that are being used, including polarizing people, the use of emotions to get people riled up, fear-mongering, outrage, conspiracy theories, the use of fake experts, trolling. And so we thought, great, so now we have these ingredients. Can we preemptively inoculate people against the underlying techniques of fake news? And that's really where the game came in, and sort of the larger research that followed on from that, where we tried to sort of preemptively prebunk, as we call it, as opposed to debunking, which comes after the fact. We call it prebunking, and that's what the game does. It tries to prebunk all of the common techniques that are used to dupe people.
Okay, there's so much in there. I want to start off by asking you about the game and how it works.
Sure. So the game, our main intervention, we have a few, but the main intervention is called bad news. It's a pun. And so, you surf to the website and you start the game. And the whole purpose of the game, it's slightly edgy. It's that you're stepping into the shoes of somebody who's actively trying to spread misinformation. Because part of the inoculation metaphor, at least at a psychological level, I mean, it's different from a biological vaccine, right? We have to think about the psychological elements, is that we have to give people a small dose of the experience of what it's like to do people. What better way is there to inoculate yourself than to kind of, walk a mile in the shoes of somebody who does this for a living? And so that's really where you start out. So you start out in the game, and you have a follower meter. It's very interactive. It simulates a social media feed. So we have different versions: WhatsApp, Twitter. Our main one uses Twitter. And so your goal is to gain as many followers while not losing any credibility. So you can't be too ridiculous. If you're being too ridiculous, you're being penalized in terms of the score. And you started out in the game by impersonating Donald Trump. And I believe the first tweet was, I'm going to declare war in North Korea, hashtag Kim Jong-un. And you send this out into the
it was funny.
It was fun. We replaced it now with Biden, because there's a new president, of course, and so we have to come up with something. Now we have a joke about Canada, North Dakota, hashtag you're being annexed. And so that's really but that's part of what we call the impersonation strategy. So impersonating other people online, which includes faking Twitter accounts. And the stuff in the game is fictional, but it's based on real things. So somebody impersonated Warren Buffett, and the only thing that's different was that there was one T instead of two T's in his name, and it gained hundreds of thousands of followers. And this account was tweeting out random stuff like, invest in what makes you happy. And so, we use those techniques in the game, but all the stuff is fictional. And so, people interact, you gain followers, it's very interactive, and then you go through 6 levels, 6 of the manipulation techniques. And so in the game, you're essentially being preempted. You're kind of being warned about the dangers of fake news, but you're also being exposed to these weakened doses of these manipulation techniques in about 15 to 20 minutes, so that you build up resilience against it. And we test people before and after. If you want to participate in the scientific research, it's always an option for people. It's not mandatory, but it's part of the intervention, and that's how we evaluate it and make sure it works and tweak it and try to improve it. So that's
the game I played of yours was pretend you run a media brand and that you post on social media, and I found it so triggering. Like, that's what I do.
Yeah, right. You start out as an anonymous netizen, and then you build your own empire. So you start your own newspaper, and you pick your own taglines, or the headline of the newspaper, and it's kind of like some names are obviously ridiculous and some names are very factual, but some names, and that's what we kind of nudge users towards, are like what they don't want you to hear, and that that lures people in.
What is it that you think works about it? Is it that by engaging in that process, people see how emotionally manipulative headlines are shared, or is it training them to just mistrust everything they see and so be skeptical? Why is it a good mechanism?
Yeah. So there's a few elements there. I think in the prebunking in general, I think there's an answer there that preemption is better than trying to fix things after the fact. In fact, it follows the same logic as the vaccine metaphor. And there's a good reason for that. So, fact checking and debunking is good. I mean, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but it's very.
Stop you there, because I've talked to propaganda analysts who tell me fact checking is not useful as a tool against disinformation. I know you disagree.
Yeah, I think we just put out the what's called the debunking handbook, which is a consensus sort of statement from over 30, 40 researchers in this field, and we kind of revisited the advice on fact checking and debunking, and I think we collectively came to the conclusion that fact checking isn't necessarily bad and debunking isn't necessarily bad. It's important how you do it in order to make sure that it has some sort of positive benefit. But the end conclusion is, even if you do it well, that it doesn't fully work. And that's for me the larger problem. There's this kind of discussion about whether it makes things worse, which is a potential side effect. So maybe it's helpful if I kind of briefly go through what the main concern is. That
yes. Okay. Great.
Yeah. So the key thing here is that repetition is bad. So we know from a lot of research in how the brain works that if you repeat misinformation, people are more likely to think it's true. And this is a very basic human mechanism, and it's the mechanism isn't bad. You know that 2 + 2 is 4 without having to think about it because you've rehearsed it many times. You've heard it many times, and so it becomes automatic. The problem is this is true for other types of information as well, bad information. The more you hear it, the more likely your brain is to mistake fluency for accuracy, which means that the more familiar something is to the brain, the more likely it is to think that it's true. And that's quite problematic because as part of the fact check, as part of the debunk, we often repeat the misinformation in an attempt to debunk it. So what happens is that it reinforces the memory connections people have with the myth because you're hearing it again and people forget about the correction. And so that's one concern. I think the bigger concern, though, is that actually what happens is that people continue to retrieve false information from memory even when they acknowledge a correction. And that's part of the kind of the virus metaphor. It really infects your brain. So it lodges itself into your memory network. Let's say you hear something about QAnon or COVID-19. It automatically links to other concepts that you know around that subject. It creates linkages. It settles in. The longer you let it sit there uncorrected, the worse it gets. And the more it's repeated, the stronger the connections between the nodes in your memory network. And so what happens essentially is that by the time people receive a correction, they acknowledge it, but they continue to retrieve false information from memory. And that's why debunking is, sometimes it can be helpful, but it doesn't work as well. And that's why we try to focus on prebunking, trying to prevent that damage from happening in the first place.
I'm going to get to prebunking. I just want to stay on this one more beat, which is,
sure.
If you're my kind of job, where your job is to provide information, or you're one of these people who shares a lot on social media, is there an effective way to debunk? Is there something you say, like QAnon is saying this is going to happen? Do you have to say words around that to make them hear it in a way they know it's disinformation as they take it in? Or do you never state the false claim to begin with?
Yeah, this is a great question, and we talk with social media companies and journalists all the time about how to do this effectively because it's not a clear-cut question. However, in our handbook, in the debunking handbook, we came up with a set of tips that we think are useful, that if you're going to debunk, if you're going to fact check, here's the right way to do it to make sure that, it doesn't have any of these negative side effects. One thing that's incredibly important is to make sure that the debunk or the fact check is as simple as the misinformation. If you're trying to debunk a myth that's very simple with some complex, nuanced story,
never going to work.
Never going to work. So you need a sticky fact or some sticky truth that's as sticky as the misinformation. The other important thing, and this is probably the most important thing, is that you need to provide people with an alternative explanation. So what happens in the brain when you try to correct something is that people acknowledge it and they say, oh, that makes sense. But now there's a gap. You thought something was true. Now it's no longer true. Now there's a gap. People don't like gaps. They fill it in. They have to fill it in with something. If you don't fill it in, people gravitate back to what they believed before. And so that's the crucial thing. If you debunk something of why isn't it true, provide people with a simple alternative explanation. And that's really the most powerful thing you can do, to provide an alternative fact-based explanation so that people can replace the gap.
So when I'm advised, you tell people, don't just debunk the thing, you tell them why someone's motivated to share this false information. Is that the kind of thing that fills the gap? Why you're being sent this?
Yeah, that can be a helpful strategy. So there isn't always an alternative explanation, but for example, you might say, okay, you can't get COVID from the vaccine. Here's what actually happens, so that people can ask, okay, but if I don't get COVID, what do I get, right? And so you need to provide people with the alternative. A third one, and this is exactly the strategy you highlighted. The third best thing you can do, and that's what we do in most of our research. A lot of people do research on this, but I find this one of the most appealing strategies: reveal the motivations of other people, and that's really one of the most powerful ways to defang conspiracy theories and fake news in general. Is exactly as you said. You tell people what the motivations are of those people who are spreading fake news, and that can be very powerful for people because we're responsive. Not necessarily always to facts, but to the intentions of other people. If you tell me somebody's trying to deceive me, somebody's trying to dupe me, and you have some evidence, then that's going to be concerning, and I'm going to have to rethink my position. So that can definitely be helpful.
So interesting, and this is so concrete. Thank you. Let's go back to pre-bunking. You were explaining when I derailed the conversation.
Totally
why does pre-bunking work?
Right. So part of it is that you don't have to wrestle with the fact that the misinformation is already deeply settled into people's belief systems and their memory, and so you have more traction. If you can prevent it from taking root in the first place, it's going to be much more effective. And so that's often what we see, that part of the explanation is that if you do it preemptively, it's much more likely to be successful. The other reason is, as you said, in the kind of pre-bunking that we do, which is often about revealing the manipulation technique. So, it's very important. In most of our stuff, we don't tell people this is right, this is wrong. What we do is we say, look, this post contains this manipulation technique, and we try to preemptively, train and inoculate people against those techniques. And then we expose them to a whole range of fake news. But we see that people are, through the fake news, people are able to then identify, oh, this is the strategy that's being used against me here. And they're much less likely to believe it, which is not the same as convincing somebody of a specific fact, but it leads people to, to question the reliability of some of the things that they're seeing. So, the revealing the manipulation attempts is part of it. And then, it heightens people's what we call deception monitoring ability, that if you feel that you're being targeted with something, that's part of deinoculation. So in order to get people motivated to defend and reject information and to sort of start the intellectual antibody production, people need to be motivated. And so they need a small form of threat, essentially. And that's really what the inoculation provides. It puts people, in a more what we call system 2 mode of information processing. You're more conscious, you're more deliberate. You're basically being told that you're a target of, you're being targeted with fake news. Somebody's trying to manipulate you. So all of a sudden people are paying attention. So that, that's part of it. And then, the game adds some other elements to it that make that, we found that that's useful, that I'm happy to elaborate on briefly, is that one, it's interactive. And so it's the way that people learn is it's much better in an interactive environment. So before, we had people come to the lab and read some science and so on. And, science is a yawn factor on some people. That's just the truth. And so what we wanted to do is turn the science into something fun and educational in an experiential way. Mark Twain once said, a man who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way. Obviously, you should never do that. But the point comes across, I think, very well, that, you just can't give people a better experience than temporarily simulating it for people in terms of, this is what it's like. And that's how people learn. We learn through experience most of the time, not through math, not through facts, even though we want that to be true. A lot of the time is just experience. So the game offers an experience to people, and I think that's why it's a powerful vehicle for learning and conferring immunity, because it speaks to people of various age groups, and it's not as it's a bit more fun and entertaining.
I want to ask you, you've worked with some companies and governments around the world. Do you tell us a little bit about what that work looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to be careful here of the stack of NDAs that I have signed. Yes. So I'll do my best. One of the first things that we thought about with the game is that the cognitive vaccine idea, it's a nice idea, but actually the ultimate metaphor for me is herd immunity. So how do we spread the vaccine? Misinformation spreads like wildfire. So how do we get the vaccine to spread? We made it for people so that it's free. Anyone can access it. We're very adamant about that. It's a tool in the public interest. It's also a public engagement tool. We gather their research. We do research on it, but people can share it. But one of the ways in which the government here in the United Kingdom, where I'm currently based, was able to help out is to offer to translate our game into pretty much every major language in the world. So together with the UK government, we were able to translate it. And that allowed us to gather cross-cultural data. How does this work in other countries? And there's some interesting variation, but we found some pretty positive results. But every culture is different, and fake news means different things in different cultures. So that was an interesting project, and that helped us actually scale the initiative. And then the latest variation on bad news that we did is Go Viral, which is an offshoot that's specifically focused on COVID-19 and trying to protect people against the most influential disinformation COVID-19, which we did with the government here and with support from places like the WHO and the United Nations. And they have what they call information volunteers, and so they can help us scale the idea to lots of people and fight back essentially with these interventions. So lots of universities and schools and governments have taken up.
Sorry, I understand you've also worked with Twitter, which did some prebunking or disinformation flagging around the election. Can you tell us anything about what that, how you helped them there? And if not, I'll pause there.
Yeah, it's funny actually. So I think we've worked with every social media company except Twitter, but Twitter did implement the pre-bunking approach. But they did. I should say they did. I should give them credit. They did this independently. I mean, there's an NBC article that came out that first made this announcement and referenced our research. So I'm glad that it got out there and that it may or may not have influenced their decision. But in the end they went with it in an unprecedented way, which I think is really interesting. And so what they did was they implemented a pre-bunk during the U.S. election. So this was obviously very, very sensitive. So I was slightly encouraged. I mean, I have a lot to say about social media companies, but I was slightly encouraged to see that they actually went for it. And so what they did was they preemptively, and here's another kind of what we call an issue-based vaccine, so a narrow spectrum injection. They told people in advance, look, voting by mail is safe. You're going to see fake news on the platform that, there's going to be a lot of fraud and that it's not safe to vote by mail. However, this total bogus, so-and-so, and here's some links to facts. And they did this preemptively. So they pre-bunked the fraudulent voting myth. And then they sent this message to all US Twitter users, I believe, if I'm not, if I have the details of this article correct. I mean, I wasn't involved in it. And so I'd love to hear how it went. I mean, I haven't heard from them in terms of the results, but I was very encouraged to see they took the pre-bunking idea and they implemented it in a real sense.
They also just announced today, and you might not be familiar with this, a program they're calling Birdwatch, which is tapping certain users to sort of be vigilant, and they monitor what might be disinformation and surface it. Is that a model that you think works or you've seen worked elsewhere?
Yeah, I saw that announcement, and it's interesting. I mean, I think Twitter is experimenting with lots of different ways of countering disinformation, which I find somewhat progressive in the sense that they're seeing and going to see how it works, and so that's interesting. Yeah. So their idea, essentially, to me, their idea is they're going to crowdsource accuracy. So they're going to ask people to rate misinformation and then make a judgment. And if enough people say something is false, they're going to label it and say there's a consensus among users that this is not credible information. And that's based on an idea of crowdsourcing judgments, and it's interesting. It's interesting. So let me say this: the literature on crowdsourcing tells us that yes, surprisingly, when you aggregate the opinions of lots of non-expert people, you can still get pretty good answers in terms of how accurate something is. Surprisingly, and this surprises most people. However, certain conditions need to be met in order for that to happen statistically. One is the assumption of independence, which means that people can't be influencing each other all the time. So so I'm asking, what happens if somebody says, oh, let's all rate this post as fake news. Let's massively, do a coordinated attack on this post and just send lots of things to Twitter saying this is fake news. Now you have a consensus that a totally legitimate news is fake news. So I can see some challenges that they're going to have to face with their moderation system, but it's interesting. I think for some things it could be beneficial.
Yeah, we'll watch that one closely. Yeah. You've spoken about the 5 rules of evidence communication. I'd love for you to talk to us about them, and in part because it's something our community is constantly talking about, how to both communicate in a way that is credible and also how to monitor what you take in and suss the information you're taking in yourself to understand the credibility of your source.
Yeah, absolutely. So these 5 rules of evidence communication were based on, a lot of research we did on how to help people communicate evidence in an honest and transparent way. And I think the end goal is to not erode trust in society. And I think that's, because even when you're not talking about fake news and conspiracies, people have questions about the vaccine that are legitimate, that are scientific, and it's not being explained well.
Right.
And so that is also a problem that could lead people to then endorse all sorts of other inaccurate things.
This is the whole reason I left mainstream media. Like, right. We don't explain things. We leave you more confused at the end, and there's too much jargon. Right. What if we explain information clearly?
Right. And that, that's part of those rules. So part of the first rule is the prebunk, which comes from the prebunking research, the prebunk misconception. So for example, one thing that we're talking about now, and we're talking to, lots of different institutions about testing this, that a lot of people, I would have thought that we'd prebunk the misconception that once you get the vaccine, you still need to maintain your public health measures, right? People can't go out and you still spread the virus and infect other people. But there seems to be a misconception that once you get the vaccine, everything's going to be good. And that's not the case for several reasons, because, the vaccine isn't 100% effective. So how do you communicate that to people without creating vaccine hesitancy? Because there's no need for that. It's safe, it's effective, but there's variation. So the second rule is be honest about the uncertainty. So if you look at the Pfizer vaccine, it's 95% on average, but there's some variation. It could be 89%, it could be 97%, right? So be honest about the uncertainty around the number, so that people don't go around thinking it's 100%. Be honest about the quality of the underlying evidence. There are things that we don't know yet about the exact way in which the virus can spread when you've been vaccinated. So you have to give people cues about, how much evidence is there? What's the weight of the evidence on something? Is it established? Is it emerging? As well as offering balance, but not false balance. This has been something I'm sure you're familiar with in the media on vaccines and climate change in the past, that it's important to inform people about both harms and benefits and pros and cons, but not in a way that's falsely balanced towards a particular perspective. So, the classic example is where you have a vaccine denier and a scientist debate each other as if it's a 50-50 debate. That's not what we want. But we do want to tell people that when they need to be careful about something, or when you need to talk to your doctor, right, you have to give people a balanced and informed perspective. And so those are kind of a few rules that we lay out, that if all media on science communication did this, I think people would be a lot less confused and feel more informed.
It's so smart. I wish you could coach everybody in the media. How do we get this to everyone? Okay, I want to ask you a couple. I know we've been talking a while, but you're fascinating. Do I have a few more minutes with you?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, these are audience questions. The most commonly asked question when I told people you're coming is, how do I talk to a family member who constantly believes misinformation and conspiracy theories? It's impossible to speak to family members who no longer believe proven facts.
Yeah, this is a great question. It's a very popular question we get, and I think the honest difficulty for me is that in a lot of research we look at averages on hundreds and hundreds of people. So when people ask me about a specific situation, it's always difficult to then give concrete advice. But here's what I've boiled it down to, what I think is useful. What I've learned is that when you directly attack people on their beliefs, that's not going to work. So what I see around me all the time, including my own family, is that people say, you're wrong, you're an idiot, this is total bogus. Why are you spreading this information? People get more closed off, they get more defensive, they dig their heels in further. It's just a strategy that doesn't work. The thing that might work, and people find this frustrating because it's a slower strategy, it's kind of a slow burn approach, is to actually not tell people that they're wrong directly, to not threaten them directly, but to, and this is something that you alluded to as well, to start raising questions about the motives for why people are spreading certain information. So often with conspiracies, I say, listen, what do you think about, do you think people make money off the fact that you share these things? Like, what, do you think conspiracies are business? Do you think it's possible that, every time you share something, somebody could profit off of it, and that's really the reason why they're spreading this information, or do they have a political agenda? Is it really that you find this to be true, or do you think that, there might be somebody else trying to influence you in some way? And to get people to question, why they do, not to tell them directly that they're wrong, but to sort of, cast doubt on the motives of some of the actors that are spreading this information. Another one is what we call a gateway. You need to find a gateway to start the conversation. And so what is that gateway? There are different gateways, a concept called persuasion. I like all the pre stuff. So persuasion... Persuasion is basically getting people in the mindset to be even open to anything you're saying. When you're going to confront a family member or a friend that you conflict with on an issue, they're not going to be in the mindset. They know who you are. They're not going to be in the mindset of being open to what you have to say on the topic. So you need to do some persuasion, and that involves finding some other common ground. You have to affirm people's identity or worldview in some way beforehand. And people find this very difficult to do, but it is something that works better than other things. For example, you might say, look, some conspiracies are real. Julius Caesar was stabbed to death 23 times, on the floor of the Senate. And people are conspiring against him. I'm not saying that conspiracies are that people who believe in conspiracies are nuts. However, this specific one, actually, that one isn't true. So now you're saying, hey, look, I respect you. Some conspiracies are real, but this one, no. And people are much more likely to then follow you in your conversation. Another one might be to say, look, we're friends, or you're, I love you, you're a close family member, but I respect your opinion, but. And so you need to find common ground first, and then that's the persuasion part, and then slowly move people out of their worldview. And you can't, this is key, you can't expect people to just flip their whole belief system around in one conversation. This needs to be repeated over time, slowly, and I think that's where you're going to see success.
And the idea, I understand, is to implant possible doubts so that they start ruminating themselves going forward and having their own questions so that they could maybe come to the conclusion on their own.
Absolutely. It's so much more powerful when people arrive at the conclusion on their own, when they don't feel that you've put it there in their mind. It's something that they've arrived at. You just need to ask the right questions. And that's kind of what we do with a lot of interventions. People seem to enjoy it because we don't tell people what's right or wrong. We let people arrive at their own conclusions about manipulation by exposing them to the techniques. And people find that, funny and interesting. But at the end of the day, it also leads them to then question, maybe I shouldn't buy into all of this stuff. Something you said earlier, actually, is that it's an interesting question whether you want to make people more skeptical in general or not. We started out just targeting specific antibodies. We don't want to make people skeptical about credible news. That's very important too. And so it is important that you ask the right questions.
Complicated. Can you speak to QAnon and why that theory and other sort of long-standing, for example, anti-Semitic tropes or conspiracy tropes about elites, why do some of these stick and others don't?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think QAnon really turned into a movement. It's no longer a single conspiracy. It's really a larger movement. And I think that the problem with that is that people start identifying with the movement. So when you talk about a single conspiracy, it's sticky, but you can get people to disbelieve it because it's, not something they necessarily identify with. It's just a single belief that's floating out there that you can influence. But once something becomes personal for people in the sense that they define part of who they are as part of a larger movement, then we're really in trouble in terms of trying to, it's no longer about correcting some misconceptions about Satan and pedophiles and things like that. It's, it's really that people now think that that's part of who they are and their friends and people they affiliate with. And that makes it so much more difficult. I believe the Phoenix office of the FBI classified it as a domestic terrorism threat. So, it's turning into a very serious movement. I think one of the things we can hope for is what we call subversion from within, is that influential actors from within the organization start defecting, which, we had a recent example of that. People are debating, is that good or bad? I think largely, it's we'll have to see what happens to the offshoots, but it's good that there is, some pushback from within the movement. But yeah, it's there's three factors that lead people to endorse conspiracy theories, and I think they're very prevalent here. One is what we call existential motives. People worry about death in the future and have a lot of anxiety about that. So we want to be comforted about that. So mitigate our existential concerns. The other is epistemological. So it has to do with knowledge and reducing uncertainty and getting control over the narrative. And another fundamental motive is relational. Conspiracy theories help people relate to other people. Often people feel marginalized, they feel alone, and now they're part of a community. People are endorsing their beliefs. They feel good about themselves. And so, it taps into basic psychological needs. And in a pandemic, those needs are heightened. And that's, I think, why you see so much attraction to it.
I can make this our last question because I don't want to take your whole day, but you're fascinating. Sure. I've been asked, can we ever fight disinformation effectively if social media companies don't change? And what do they need to do to help fight this virus?
Yeah, I love this question. You got a great audience here. I think, one of the ways, and this is part of the reason why we work with governments and social media companies, is to try to get their help in implementing evidence-based strategies, academically tested, scientifically evaluated strategies, not stuff that people just, decide that they want to try, but stuff that we have some evidence for. And And it's difficult. We did have a project with the Department of Homeland Security, the cybersecurity unit, and our game's called Harmony Square, and it deals with disinformation during elections, which was very timely at the during the election. They put the game out there, which was good. We worked with WhatsApp. We created a version for WhatsApp. They were during the lynchings in India. They were very concerned about how WhatsApp was being used, and so we built a version for them that runs on WhatsApp. But at the end of the day, what they need to do, Facebook, Twitter, Google, I should say that I work with most of these companies, so it's people know that I have at least some experience with it and also some affiliation with it. But I don't think that they're doing enough at the end of the day to actually implement these things. I mean, they're helpful in funding and evaluating and looking at it. But then they have to take the final step and actually implement it across their platforms. And it's the same with government. And I'm pleased to see that some governments are now implementing it and are testing and evaluating. And that's very important. But that's the crucial step that's lacking. And I think the reason why it's lacking is because their incentive structure is all wrong. So currently, the currency is engagement. If you reduce engagement on the platform, if you fight misinformation by reducing engagement, that's not always helpful to them. So they want solutions that are effective for fighting disinformation that don't decrease engagement on the platform. And that's just really difficult. And so until we have a new way for social media companies to make money,
subscriber-based. Yeah.
Subscribe. Yeah. So we're not going to get this issue solved without the massive cooperation of these companies, and they need to change the way they earn some of their revenue.
But, in the U.S., we're starting a conversation about regulation, and Washington's now highly motivated to impose new regulations on these social media companies. Are there sort of concrete things that could be included in government regulations that would help minimize disinformation on the platforms?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I remember in his congressional testimony, Mark Zuckerberg said, I'm not opposed to legislation as long as it's the right one. And of course, what's the right legislation for him versus other people that's a difficult question. A lot of our research is about empowering people to discern fact from fiction for themselves. But we have to be careful that doesn't become an argument for social media companies to then not do something. They say, "Oh, look at this great research. We want to help people make better decisions." But at the same time, I think they also need to be held accountable for what happens on the platform. Some of these things do backfire. So, for example, censoring or heavily or algorithmic solutions. They're very keen on algorithmic solutions, but sometimes classify stuff incorrectly, and then it leads to big PR scandals. And so it's difficult. It's difficult. But I think at the end of the day, what we do need is accountability for what happens on their platform, getting them to recognize that if you can target people politically on your platform, you are an arbiter of truth. You are involved in trafficking information, and you're responsible for what happens on that platform, regardless of what you let people do or pay for. And I think that's the most crucial argument, really, is to look at micro-targeting. And I've seen some companies, I believe it was Twitter, who was banning political ads and targeting of that. Yeah, but again, it's if I'm an actor, I might decide that I'm not going to register with Twitter as a political organization. I'm going to register as Joe the farmer, and I'm going to buy political ads. And so it's a real challenge. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. I think we need both kind of solutions.
Dr. van der Linden, your work is so fascinating and important, and I'm grateful for your time and your contributions.
I'm really pleased to have been on the show. It was great. Thanks for having me.